Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to share with all of you. I'm actually a College of the Atlantic alumna, so it's always nice to come back to the island as well. So today I want to share with you a little bit about how paleoecology and the science of the past can be used to, not just for science fiction, but actually for things like conservation questions. And so I want this to be very conversational. Feel free to interrupt me. I'm going to talk at you for just a little bit and end with a provocative question, which is the one I'm starting with, which is, should we clone the woolly mammoth to save the tundra from climate change? And before we get to that question, because I know that there would be some interest in this, I want to talk a little bit about how we would do this, or how people are trying to do this right now. And fortunately, I guess, one positive byproduct of the gold mining industry up in the Yukon is that there are thousands of extremely well-preserved fossils that are coming out of this sediment. So as they blast it with water, tusks and bones and things are coming out of the permafrost. That's a baby mammoth molar right there that Beth Shapiro is holding on to. And so when you have these really well-preserved fossils, one of the first things people realize is, hey, there's probably DNA in these, right? So the permafrost has protected these fossils from the environment, right? So they've been cold, kept frozen. And so that opened up this idea of cloning woolly mammoths, and this whole concept of de-extinction kind of rose around the woolly mammoth. And so how do you go from that to this? Well, it's a little complicated. So plan A was to clone the mammoth, proper cloning. So how many of you guys remember Dolly the sheep? Right? So in the 90s, Dolly the sheep. The idea is to use what's called somatic cell nuclear transfer. So the idea is exactly the same process that they used with Dolly the sheep. So what you do is you take a woolly mammoth cell, and you take an egg cell from Dolly, and you basically swap the woolly mammoth's nucleus. No, sorry, not from Dolly, so from an elephant. Sorry, we're getting into way much. sorry. So you take an egg cell from an elephant, and you take a body cell, any non-reproductive cell that you can find from a mammoth, and you zap it, and you swap the nucleus out and plop it into that egg cell. And then you implant that into a modern elephant surrogate and raise a baby mammoth, right? Sounds really easy. The problem is that we've never found an intact mammoth cell, right? UV light, bacteria, the frozen temperature shreds up cells, just the ravages of time. You know, the 10,000 years since these mammoths were wandering around the Arctic, a lot has happened to their cells. So we've never found an intact cell that you can actually pull a nucleus out of to put into an elephant cell. Yeah?
Is that a mummified elephant?
That is a mummified mammoth. Right? So this is to give you a sense of how well preserved some of these are. This is Liuba. She was a baby mammoth who died at about 3 months old, roughly 50,000 years ago. She slid into a riverbank away from her mother, was covered up by rocks and gravel really quickly, and so she was incredibly well preserved. So you can see her skin, her fur, the contents of her stomach. We know that she ate her mother's feces, possibly to inoculate herself with the healthy gut bacteria, right? So we know a tremendous amount about these mammoths from the fossil record. So they're not necessarily, this whole process of cloning a mammoth is made easier by the fact that we have amazing preservation. But even this is not enough to find an intact cell, right? That's a big challenge. All right, so just the somatic cell nuclear transfer, Dolly the sheep method is out. It's not going to happen, right? So scrap plan A. Plan B, sequence a mammoth. You just build it like Legos from the ground up, right? You just build its entire genome. If you've got somebody nodding in the background, okay. So here's what we're going to try plan B. All right, so here's a woolly mammoth tusk. You pull all those A's, C's, T's, and G's out of that tusk, and you try to sequence the woolly mammoth genome, and you just build it from the ground up. That's really difficult to do. So if you were to take a swab of my cheek and look at all the DNA on that swab, 99% of it would be from me. Maybe 1% would be from my environment, some pollen I inhaled, a little bit of lunch, some random bacteria, something I stuck in my mouth, like a carrot, who knows. And about 1% of that DNA would be from other stuff, right? That's pretty good. Woolly mammoths, though, if you were to take a sample from that tusk, about 55% of that DNA we know comes from the mammoth, but all the rest of it comes from other stuff. Bacteria that was breaking down the mammoth tissue as soon as it warmed up. You see human or dog here. That could be ancient humans and ancient dogs. It could also be the technician who's working on it, right? So when you have such rare DNA, it's really easy to contaminate what you've got. And so it's really tricky. But this is actually not bad. They successfully put together the entire Neanderthal genome with only 1% successful recovery of DNA. So it's not as hard as you might think. But when you see the DNA in the fossil record, when you pull ancient DNA out of an organism, if modern DNA looks like this, ancient DNA looks like that, right? It's broken up into tiny little bits. So there's tons and tons of little scrappy pieces of DNA. You don't necessarily know where they go. So in order to figure out where to put them and what's mammoth DNA versus something else, you need to compare it to something we know, like an elephant. In this case, the African elephant that woolly mammoths diverged from 4.5 million years ago. But that's not useful if we want to clone a mammoth, because we're interested in what makes a mammoth different from an elephant. And if we're only matching up with the things that make elephants and mammoths similar, we might be missing a lot of genes that we actually care about, the mammothy genes. So we have all these gaps in that sequence of A's and T's and C's and G's, all the little genes here. And it's actually a lot harder than you'd think to build to build a Lego mammoth, right? If every Lego is an individual gene. And so, if you were actually able to do that, if you could fill in every single gap just by sequencing piece after piece after piece of mammoth bone or skin, then you'd still have to get that genome into a chromosome, which we don't know how to do, and then get that chromosome into a cell, which we don't know how to do, and then into the nucleus, and then get the nucleus into the cell. So we know that part from Dolly the sheep. We've got that down. But there's still huge, huge gaps there in terms of building a mammoth from the ground up. And so we can scrap Plan B, at least for now. So Plan C, what if we don't need to actually build a mammoth? What if we could just build part of a mammoth? So thanks to some new technology known as CRISPR, basically is a way of using the immune defense system of bacteria as a tool to target specific genes and move things around in the genome. So what you can actually do is, once you've isolated some of those genes in a mammoth that you're interested in, you can use this new technology to then target the same place on the elephant genome and insert the gene that you want, the mammoth gene, into the building blocks of the elephant genome. So what kinds of genes would you do that with? Well, we know that there are, in the 4.5 million years since woolly mammoths and African elephants diverged, there have been something like 4 billion base pair changes, right? It's a lot of change from one genome to the other. And we've identified some of the genes that make them different, right? That's what we want to know, is what makes a mammoth a mammoth. So we know they had small ears to protect from the cold. We know that they had thick red hair, thick layers of fat under their skin, and a really interesting one was a kind of an antifreeze in their blood, in their hemoglobin, that allowed them to pump extra oxygen to the ends of their bodies to basically allow these mammoths to survive much colder temperatures than an elephant could survive today, than a human could survive even in the Arctic. And so once you got those genes, you could, using this technology, swap out the mammoth version for the elephant version. And basically what you've done is you can edit an elephant genome to make it more like a mammoth. You take those mammoth characteristics you're interested in. And this is not a picture of a real mammothy elephant. This baby elephant just happens to have fuzzy red hair. But this is the general idea. So sort of phase one would be to confer those mammothy properties onto an elephant. And then what you do is you basically created a transgenic elephant. So that's the goal now. So people have ditched the idea of traditional style cloning, and now people like George Church at Harvard are actively working on identifying the specific genes and then making a mammothy elephant. So it's not about creating a pure mammoth clone from the past, or resurrecting a lost species. It's about taking parts of that lost species and bringing those parts back in the form of a modern elephant. Because once you've done that, you've got your modern elephant surrogate mother, and the mother can host the mammoth elephant. So it sounds like science fiction, but it's part of a broader movement known as de-extinction or restoration ecology. The idea that you can take extinct species, everything from the passenger pigeon to the dodo to the woolly mammoth, any case where you have really good parts left of those animals that have been lost, you can bring them back, and there are people who are actively working on this. And in fact, about a year ago, George Church's lab at Harvard successfully inserted some of those mammoth genes into an elephant cell. Now, they haven't gone as far as to have a cloned mammothy elephant or a transgenic elephant, but that was a year ago, and that's an incredible amount of progress in just a really short amount of time, since most of the mammoth genome was sequenced just 2 years ago. Okay, so why would you want to do this, right? What is the point of all of this? We know we can, right? So why? Well, it's interesting. One question I always have as an ecologist is, what are you actually trying to do? You have to think of these organisms as species with their own habitats and their own needs and their own behaviors. So what's interesting is we actually know a lot about these animals from the fossil record. One of the things we know from this right here, does anybody know what that is? Looks like a tree ring. It's not. It's a tusk. Yeah, so if you take an elephant tusk or a mastodon tusk or a mammoth tusk and you take a cross section, just like a tree, they put on growth rings, just like trees do. And those growth rings are thicker when things are good, and they get really thin and squashed when the environment is bad. So from these growth rings, we know that woolly mammoths were matriarchal. So when you're in a matriarchal society, who holds all the power? The women. I hear all the women laughing, like, we know. So the women, the females, in fact, the oldest females. So you're like, okay, how do you know that the mammoths were matriarchal from a cross-section of a tusk? Well, if you compare male tusks with female tusks, the female tusks put on regular growth rings every year. Sometimes they're a little skinnier, sometimes they're a little fatter when the climate is better or worse, but they're pretty much regular. But if you look at male tusks, across the board, whenever the boy mammoths hit puberty, their tusks get really tight and tiny for several years. And then they kind of widen out again. And what we think this represents is this is the time where the young male mammoths get kicked out of the herd. They're like, yeah, you go fend for yourself, go figure it out. And a lot of them go off and die. In fact, when you look at places, I work at the La Brea tar pits out in California, and the only mammoths you find in the tar pits are young men, young male mammoths. So they're engaging in risky behavior, right? They don't know where to go, where the safe places are. They don't have grandma mammoth to tell them, we don't go over there, it's dangerous. We go over here where the food and the water are, right? And so, but the male mammoths that make it through that dangerous time then come back to the herd as big, strong, smart grown-ups that bring a better genome back to the herd, right? They're better they're better adapted to their environment, right? And so from that we know, something of the behavior of these animals, right? Which means that they have social structure. Mammoths would have families, just like modern elephants do today. They have memories. We know the herd sizes from captured footprints. We know about what size family groups were, how many individuals would travel together. We know where they would travel, what their average home size was, what their migratory pathways were. All from clues in the fossil record, many of which are the same that they use in forensics. So if you guys watch shows like CSI or Bones, a lot of those same tools are used by paleoecologists like me, except we're reconstructing past environments. So I wanted to mention that because there's actually a lot that we know about mammoth ecology and mammoth behavior that tells us certain things about what they would need to survive. So when we start chatting, think about whether or not a mammothy elephant in a lab is really a mammoth. And when these mammoths are cloned, they have a home. There's a place called Pleistocene Park which already exists. It's a few hundred square kilometers in Siberia, and they're already reintroducing large animals to Pleistocene Park. And the idea is to try to see, the original impetus was to see whether or not you could get big animals to survive in the Arctic in our current climate, to prove that humans must have killed them and not climate change. But since the original inception of this project, the idea is actually to use this as a way to study how large animals affect the tundra when the climate changes. So why, I promised we'd talk about why would you do this. Well, one of the arguments is actually to protect modern elephants. So thousands of elephants are killed by poachers every year. I don't know how many, what number we're up to right now, but it's a lot, right? And we know that elephants are keystone species. They're really important in the ecosystems that they live in now. And so the idea is, okay, if you could open up all of the Arctic as a habitat for elephants to keep them from going extinct, would you do it? So would you give these guys some mammoth genes so that they could survive in the cold Arctic if the alternative was extinction? That's a question for you. I don't have the answer. The second really interesting question for me as an ecologist who studies the impacts of large animals is you might actually be able to help this, the tundra ecosystem. So there's been some really interesting work that we've done in my lab, and also people who work in the modern Arctic have also found, is that if you have large herbivores running through the tundra, or any grassland actually, it is more resilient to climate change than if you don't have herbivores, which seems weird because you think, well, these herbivores are eating plants, right? So they should be damaging the ecosystem. Well, you have to remember that all these species have co-evolved with large animals over millions and millions of years, right? Horses and camels evolved in North America along with our grasslands and then spread out into the rest of the world. We have a long history here in North America of co-evolution between the plants and these large animals. And so from these kinds of experiments, we know that the Arctic actually seems to do better when you warm it if there are herbivores, big native herbivores. Some little bonfires there. And one of the ways that that happens is because of the specific kinds of things large animals do. They knock trees down, which in this case gives all of the other little plants a chance to get water and light, right? So this is one of the reasons we have a savanna and not a grassland or a forest in Africa. That coexistence of the trees and the grass depends on the things that the elephants are doing, right? We also know that they poop, they spread seeds, they're moving nutrients around. There are all kinds of functions that these animals provide that are really important. And those seem to help the tundra, when you warm it, do better than if you don't have the animals around. And so one question is, if we could put a woolly mammoth or a mammothy elephant in the tundra, will that help it survive global warming? And not just help the tundra, but help us too, because there are 1,000 tons of carbon just in the first 3 meters of permafrost alone. That's more carbon than is in all the plants on the surface of the earth and in the atmosphere combined right now. So once you start warming all this permafrost and trees start coming in and breaking the soil up, which is already happening, more carbon is getting released. And climate scientists have no idea how much of an impact this is going to have in the next 100 years on climate change. So we could be releasing a ton of carbon, many, many hundreds of tons of carbon into the atmosphere very quickly in these feedback loops, these sort of snowball effects of releasing carbon to the atmosphere as you warm all this permafrost. Now, if having large herbivores prevents some of that from happening, is that worth making a mammothy elephant? I don't know. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, my question is, I thought the problem with the permafrost was that there was methane trapped in it.
Yep.
And that as it warms up, the methane's released, and that's a really, amplified global warming effect.
Yeah.
So what would the woolly mammoth do with relation to methane?
So it's where the methane comes from, all that trapped plant matter. So all of the buildup of the permafrost is from all the plants. They're not rotting away. They're just being trapped there. And so you have all this bacteria in the soil, and when they start to break down that carbon, they release a lot of methane. And so as long as the permafrost stays frozen, all of that methane, the gas, and also the physical carbon from the unbroken down plants.
Yeah, the fermentation.
Yeah, exactly, right. So all of that stays kind of trapped in the Arctic.
And with the reviving of woolly mammoth, slow that process down.
Yeah, so some of the experiments that they're doing in Pleistocene Park, they're actually taking things like horses and other animals and bison and things and putting them in Pleistocene Park. And they're showing that they prevent the trees and the shrubs from moving into the tundra. And so the idea is that the roots break up the soil and make it more active, and you get more carbon and methane released. Yeah, so that's the thinking, yeah.
Would that also increase the albedo in
Yeah.
winter so that you get more snow and ice and
It's
it
interesting.
would last longer?
Right, so albedo is basically reflectance, how shiny a surface is. And so when you have a snow-covered tundra, it has a very high reflectance, right? It's one of the reasons why you want to paint your roof a light color, not a dark color, if you live in a hot place. So trees and other dark vegetation that shed snow are darker, so they actually, when they spread, they tend to warm the climate, right? And so you have to, there's a lot of interesting feedbacks. It's not just about the carbon. The reflectance actually, or the albedo of the Arctic may play an even bigger role in these feedback systems than the carbon or the greenhouse gases themselves. Because as the trees, like the boreal forest, as it marches into the tundra, it's darker than the surrounding ground. And so it'll create this warming effect. The same problem happens where when you lose sea ice, the sea ice is nice and white, and the ocean is dark. And so as you lose sea ice from warming, then you get even more warming because less of that heat's reflected. So it's a sort of runaway train effect.
Is there any evidence that this has actually happened in Pleistocene Park?
No, well, not in Pleistocene Park, but there's some evidence that it happened in the Pleistocene. So when we lost the mammoths, there was a big expansion of birch trees. And some people have worked on computer models that have linked the two events together. That the loss of the mammoths allowed for the plants to change, which then triggered changes in the climate. Not so much because they were taking up carbon or anything, but because of the change in reflectance. The Earth's surface just absorbed more heat. Yeah. Yes?
How would they survive during the winter, herbivores? What would they eat?
Good question. A lot of them would have migrated, so they would have come, and certainly when, I don't have a good picture here, but, 13,000 years ago, we would have been under a couple kilometers of ice here in Acadia, or in MDI. And so, everything that lives in the Arctic now would have been living further south, right? And so Long Island would have been the tundra. Ohio and Pennsylvania would have been the tundra. And so during during the winters of the Ice Age, a lot of these animals have adaptations to get to the plants underneath the snow. So they think a lot of those big tusks are not actually for defense because of the way that they're shaped, but they're actually for sort of side sweeping the snow to be able to get to the plants. Yeah, because they're not built well for fighting, right? The way they're shaped, they're sort of this weird
Like shovels.
Yeah, they're like shovels, right? And so partly by moving around to new places, and partly by just changing their behavior, they would have been able to survive.
And so if we did introduce these animals into that place in Russia, would they be able to migrate as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's not big enough. This is one of the problems I have with Pleistocene Park, is it's not as big as we know the home ranges of these animals are. Right? It's not enough habitat. But certainly Siberia or the Arctic or the Yukon has plenty of open habitat, but the sort of fenced out area of Pleistocene Park is not big enough. We know, for example, by looking at the teeth, so whenever you eat plants, or let me back up, plants growing in soil pick up the fingerprint of that soil in their tissues. And then when you eat the plants, you pick up the fingerprint of the soil via the plants into your tissues. This is one way, if you guys have watched, like I said, any of those CSI type shows where they say, oh, we know that the killer was, in this particular area because of the chemistry of the soil. So we can actually look at the bones of extinct animals and say how big their home range would have been or where they migrated. So we know that there were mastodons, for example, living in Florida that migrated up into South Carolina every year. So that's about the home range size we're talking about. Yeah. So it's a huge question, and not one that the people working on cloning are really thinking about. They don't talk to people like me. Yes.
So there are like more plants coming in that would be like loosening up the soil and like letting carbon into the atmosphere, but those plants are also taking carbon out of the atmosphere. Like, how does that balance with if there were
That's a really good question, and scientific community spent a lot of time thinking about how climate affects plants, and has only recently been thinking about how plants affect climate. And so these feedbacks are really tricky because you have to think about how much carbon are they taking up, also what their color is, how reflectant are they, how much do they reflect? Also, how much moisture do they release, right? So if you go down to a place like the Midwest, you know, people spend their entire scientific career trying to decide if corn is better or worse than grass for the climate because of how much how much moisture it takes up versus how much, you know, and some of the answers to those questions are not intuitive, right? So the question you asked is an awesome question, and you could do a whole PhD on that, and you should do a PhD on that. You need to know, right? So that's the answer is we don't know, but people are actively working on it, and it's a really good question. Yeah. You're doing the right kind of thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that with the decline of the mammoth, the birches went up. Is there something like when they drill cores with ice that you look at, let's say, pollen, and you know what was the population density of different species over time?
Yeah, that's my job. Yeah. Yeah. So actually, yeah.
You could explain about that, because how
Oh,
do you know
yeah.
what pollen related to what plant?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So I actually mostly don't work with bones. I actually mostly work with pollen and other fragments of plants that are in cores that we drill down into the bottoms of lakes or in the mud or in bogs and things like that. And your question was, how do you know what's
there and how much of it? Like,
Yeah.
do you look at DNA, or you just look at a microscope with millions of different shapes?
thousands of different shaped pollen grains? I think it was like, I don't know, it was 1/30th of my life when I finished I calculated it, how much time I spent in front of a microscope when I finished my PhD. But all the different kinds of plants around us produce pollen that has a unique shape. And so you can dissolve all the mud and just put the pollen on a microscope slide and identify what was growing. Yeah, hundreds of different kinds, different species. And what's really nice is, you know, it's when you think about, you know, the mammoth ecosystem, it's easy to think, okay, this was a long time ago, these organisms weren't there. But if you look outside, everything around us today is an Ice Age survivor. So all of these species were around too. So all of the plants are the same plants that were around when the mammoths were there, which makes it really easy for people like me to study the plants because I know exactly what different kinds of plants produce what kinds of pollen because they're still around, right? So that's really
When
useful.
they got, you said there was the stomach contents of
Yeah.
food. So did
Yeah.
that jive with what they ate was what you would say was around? at
Oh
that
yeah,
time?
absolutely. So there's a couple different methods. You can look at the bits of plants in the stomachs of these animals as you pull them out. You can look for fragments of plants in their dung. In our lab, we're now starting to look at DNA in the dung to see if that picks up the plants better than the pollen does. One, as a side note for people who want to be geeky about pollen, the pollen that we pick up in the fossil record tends to be wind-blown pollen. The insect-dispersed stuff, which is usually all the little flowering plants, right? Those are usually moved around by little insects. That doesn't get into our record as well. So it's harder to capture. It's really easy to capture trees and grasses, but a lot of the other stuff, it's kind of invisible to us. So we're looking for creative ways around that problem. Yeah, go ahead.
Going back with talking about the different kinds of plants growing on there and the mammoths, if you were to introduce a new plant that doesn't have as deep of roots, that are lighter in color, if we were to put some of that out there and let that grow for a while they work on the mammoths, then when you introduce the mammoths, they would eat it and help spread the different type of plants. It would be like a duo team to help sell. But then at the same time, do you want to change that environment to something new?
Yeah.
But it might help a little bit having the lighter colors, white instead of dark green or red.
It's
like that.
It's a really good question, and what you're talking about kind of falls under the umbrella of what's known as geoengineering. So the idea of trying to come up with a way to engineer the earth, right? To change the earth's climate by changing its surface or changing the processes. Instead of changing our habits, right? Like how much CO2 we put in the atmosphere and those sorts of things. The idea is to try to adapt to climate change. Yeah, or work with it, or sort of mitigate the effects of it by changing the earth. Yeah, it's an interesting question. People have talked about that more from the perspective of planting things that suck more carbon down, less from the perspective of more reflectant plants. You get into huge cans of worms because there are cases where where introductions have gone amok, right? If you think about like the cane toad story in Australia, right? So there's always this concern, right? Like, oh, wait, is this the right thing to do? And at some point you have to make a decision, but I think it's really important that every one of us is involved in those kinds of conversations, not just people, not just the scientists, right? I think that there has to be community stakeholder involvement. So yeah, it's definitely a possibility. Yeah.
Do you work with any of the rewilding groups?
I don't personally. The research that I do directly relates to rewilding. Most of my research has been on the impacts of the extinction of large animals. What kinds of things did they do in the landscape that we lost when we lost them? And so when I started grad school, rewilding, or the idea of bringing back an animal or its closest cousin to a landscape where it was lost, was so controversial. And at the time it was elephants and lions in the Great Plains. We don't have mammoths and saber-tooths anymore, so we're going to take their modern cousins and have them do the things that the mammoths and saber-tooths would have done. Now that's way less controversial because people are talking about cloning instead, right? So that's sort of like, oh, the rewilding, that's a little bit kooky, but man, this cloning stuff, that's crazy. What I think is interesting about rewilding though, is it opened up a lot of conversations about the consequences of extinction and ways around that. So the extreme end is putting elephants in Iowa, but there are also opportunities like the Aldabra tortoise, right, in Mauritius, where you have these plants that are dying because the tortoise was hunted to extinction and can't disperse their seeds. Well, if there's a tortoise on a nearby group of islands, we can bring it over. Tortoises are not known for their rampaging behaviors. They'll probably be okay. It's pretty similar. It can eat the seeds, poop them out, and the tree won't die, right? And so things like that have been really successful. And so you can credit the idea of rewilding, for saving some species from extinction. So it's not just the extreme examples. There's also sort of a more safe, kind of basic opportunities too. Yeah. Yes?
Doesn't making these changes kind of relieve us from the responsibility of taking charge of our own actions?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So, I mean, the work that I do doesn't specifically address why these animals went extinct, but because I try to focus on consequences, because that's most relevant to today. We know why elephants are going extinct, right? It's not a surprise or controversy. But it's interesting because I've heard people say that if we caused mammoths to go extinct through hunting, we have a moral responsibility to bring them back. If we didn't, if it was just climate change, if it was natural, then we don't have to worry about it. We can just let things lie. So I've heard responsibility used in very different ways in these kinds of discussions. But you're right that by focusing on geoengineering type approaches, does that mean that we can keep burning fossil fuels at the same rate? I personally think, and this is just me, that we need a wide variety of approaches as soon as possible. Because, I can't even get people to agree that climate change is happening, right? 99% of the scientific community agrees, but 50% of the general public agrees, right? So the lack of will makes it really hard. And I think we're going to have to be really creative. but I don't want to be the only one with an opinion on that. I want to hear from you guys too. In the back?
So I study how or when things flower or leaf out and how that's shifting with climate change and how that might have effects on interactions with, for example, plants and pollinators or plants and herbivores. And so if you have a really dynamic system already in the tundra and then you add an animal that maybe hasn't been around for a while and maybe has different expectations of when the timing of things should happen, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how changes in the timing of things plant-wise might affect or lead to weird interactions with a new / old herbivore.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one thing that I'll say is that, you know, all the plants in the Arctic, you know, would have interacted with mammoths relatively recently from a geologic standpoint. And it's important to remember that the past is not just like flipping a switch onto, you know, from on to off. So it wasn't like mammoths to no mammoths. There was a lot of change that happened in there, including climate change, and people coming and changing fires and things like that. And so as a paleoecologist with a long view on ecosystems, I tend to think that they're more resilient in some ways than not. But that was also when we had a lot more space and a lot more varieties of those plants, right? A lot more, just a lot more individuals, right? And so I don't think that gives us permission to not care about the flowering plants of Acadia, because, you know, they're tiny little islands of biodiversity surrounded by a sea of urbanization, right? But I do want to know, as a paleo person, I want to know whether or not, you know, we know that climate has changed a lot during the evolutionary lifespan of these plants, and I want to know whether or not plant-pollinator relationships or plant-herbivore relationships were profoundly disrupted during those past climate changes. And is that something we should still be worried about to the extent we are now, or can we kind of back off on that and put our concern elsewhere? Which is why the work you're doing is important. Yeah. Oh, wait, got one here? Yeah.
How many generations would it take for an elephant to get 100% wool?
Ooh, that sounds like something that I would have had to answer on a test. That's a good question. Are there any geneticists in the room? Anybody? I guess it depends on how much mammoth they start off with, right? So if you take an elephant, just a random elephant now, and put them in the Arctic, they probably wouldn't survive. But if you gave them some of those mammoth genes, like if you could make an elephant have thick fur and lots of fat and little ears and, you know, blood that made it survive in the cold, then, you know, how long would it take for it to look? I don't know. It's a good question. Probably, you know, elephants live 70 years.
25 generations.
Yeah, we've got a guess of 25 generations. Yeah, we could try it. If you build a time machine, you can tell us.
You could get involved, and the ones that do best take their genes and add in a little more mammoth.
Right, right.
And keep doing it that way, so it's like a directed evolution.
Oh, so yeah, right. So if you think about, you know, cases where we've domesticated foxes, or, you know, we're humans, and any like corn, you know, corn took a long time, like thousands of years, but you can do foxes in a few generations, right, just by saying, oh, we've got these extra traits that we really like. So if humans were involved, it would be faster, right? So if we could control which of the mammothy elephants were breeding, it would be faster. But if we just let nature run its course, it would be slower. That's my answer. Yeah.
I wonder if we let nature like run its course and whether they evolved in like survival of the fittest, whether they would evolve to be like the woolly mammoths used to be or become a completely different species based on the new development.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you know, thinking about, you know, the woolly mammoth was only about 200,000 years old. It descended from the steppe mammoth of Asia, right? Which, you know, so there's a sort of progression of different species. So then it got isolated here in North America, and even it was a little bit different. But you know, interestingly, there was a study that just came out that showed there were several species of mammoth and mastodon in North America. Not all the mammoths were woolly. There were mammoths all the way down in the Carolinas and Texas and Mexico. And the genetic study that just came out showed that all these different species of mammoths were reproducing all the time with each other. So they weren't really pure species because they were able to reproduce together. And so it doesn't really answer your question, but it's a cool idea that the idea of what we think of as a species is more fluid than we generally think it is, both through time and then also across space, right? Because if a mammoth over in Florida could mate with a different species of mammoth in Illinois, are they really different mammoths? They might look different in the fossil record, but they could still reproduce.
Yeah, I think there's like 30,000 species that disappear each year. And so you don't have to go back like maybe 10,000 years when the mammoth died off. But there's things like the dodo that was maybe 250 years ago, and the carrier pigeon that was 100 years ago. So their DNA may be more intact, like the picture you showed.
Yep.
So maybe can those species be brought back more easily?
Absolutely.
Is anybody trying to do that?
Yes. People are trying to resurrect the passenger pigeon.
The dodo, the moa?
Dodo, I'm not sure why not. I haven't seen people talking about that one as much, and I don't know. Passenger pigeons, yes. But just out of curiosity, well, maybe this is going to backfire, but how many of you, if you found out that the zoo in DC had a cloned passenger pigeon, how many of you would go see it? Just like 4 hands, 5 hands.
Are you talking a special trip or are you talking about it?
Yeah. Okay, how about a moa or a dodo? A couple more hands. How about a woolly mammoth? Okay, a lot more hands, right? Okay, so the people who have talked about the woolly mammoth have said that it would be like, one of the reasons they want to do it is that it would be like the moon landing for biology. It would get people so excited, so interested in science. I mean, think about what the moon landing did for science funding in the US. So did the Cold War, but that was a different story. People go to see pandas, right, exactly. And so can you imagine like what it would do in terms of an injection of interest in science and biology? But it also might backfire and people might be horrified at scientists playing God. I don't know what you guys think. But yeah, it's a good question. No, but people are talking about other species too. And there are things that are going extinct because they don't have a passenger pigeon to disperse them. The dune cherry around the Great Lakes is going out because the passenger pigeon is no longer eating and pooping it across the countryside. Yeah. Yes?
What do you see as your major roadblocks?
Oh, well, I'm not trying to clone mammoths, but you mean like so in terms of the project generally?
Exactly.
Yeah. So I actually think that one of their roadblocks is that they're not talking to people like me who study the ecology and the rest of the ecosystem that these animals come out of. And I think that needs to happen. I wonder, when I talk about this with people, I like to talk about mammoth cloning because I think it touches on so many interesting ideas about climate change and extinction conservation. A lot of people say, we can't protect the elephants we have. Why are we wasting all this money on mammoths? And it's interesting because, so I think that is a roadblock, right? The lack of public will, if there is one. People tend not to be, there's a small percentage of people who are like, yes, science is exciting, this is great, let's do it, let's have mammoths. And then the rest of the people are like, whoa, 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 we're playing God, what are you doing, it's a waste of money. I will say, for full disclosure, this is all privately funded science. So the mammoth cloning efforts of people like George Church, it's private foundation money. And the people who are putting their money into this, it's not elephants or mammoths, it's Mars or mammoths, right? They want big gee-whiz science kinds of projects. So fortunately, so far, it's not diverting a lot of conservation efforts away. And when I first started thinking about this, I was pretty against it on ecological grounds. The idea being, you're not making a real mammoth, you're just making some freak animal that doesn't know what it is, and it doesn't have a grandma mammoth to tell it what to do and how to be. And I'm not interested in some sort of pure cloning, let's replicate this thing from the past. But then I talked to Beth Shapiro, who's been active, she's one of these people working with ancient DNA, you saw some pictures of her. And she was the one who first told me about the idea of protecting the tundra with a cloned mammoth elephant. And she has a fantastic book, if you guys are interested in this, called How to Clone a Woolly Mammoth, which gets into all the details about this. And it changed a lot of my thinking about this process. But I think public will is a roadblock. And you know, we could talk about things like poaching. I mean, I tend to think that the roadblocks are more societal and social than they are scientific. I think that if we let go of the idea of pure mammoth cloning, the opportunities are much more extensive. But if someday in the next 10 to 20 years we can figure out how to put an entire genome together and stick it in a chromosome, stick the chromosome in a cell, I think we'll get there. We'll have a mammoth elephant way before that, like probably in the next 5 years, maybe 10 years. Don't quote me on that. But I mean, yeah, I mean, just in the last couple of years, we went from, 2 years ago, we had a full-ish woolly mammoth genome. Now we have identified and isolated specific genes that do specific things. I mean, this is happening so fast. In the back.
Are scientists in Russia and the U.S. competing in woolly mammoth cloning?
I don't know of Russian scientists. So the Church Lab is the big one for the Mammoth Elephant project. There are Japanese and Korean scientists that are doing the Build a Mammoth from the Bottom Up project. I don't know that anyone is actively working on the Dolly style cloning. I think because you need the intact cell. And I think that with so many really good fossils that have come out of the permafrost, and they just haven't found any. I think people have given up on that. I could be wrong, but mostly it's Korea and Japan are trying to build the bottom-up mammoth. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So, since there's a lot of pollution going on in China, so if you put the woolly mammoth in the Arctic, will it survive? Because the ice is melting very quickly, possibly because of pollution.
Right, so that's a good question. So as the Arctic changes, it won't look quite like it did when the mammoth was around. A woolly mammoth might have a hard time, but other kinds of mammoths might have an easier time. Because remember, we live in a warm period now, and 20,000 years ago we were in an ice age. But these are cycles, and there have been maybe 20 cycles of warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold, warm, cold over the last 2.5 million years. And all the mammoths made it through all the warm periods before. So as long as we could kind of keep things within the range of what they've been, I think they'd make it. But the problem is, like you said, because of all the pollution, and not just China, we're doing it here too, right? The pollution that we're putting in the air is, and the carbon dioxide from our fossil fuel use is making the planet warmer. And if we make the planet warmer than it's been in 2.5 million years of ice ages, then everything on the planet is going to be in trouble, because that's well outside of what all of the plants and animals are used to. Not just the mammoths, but they'll have a hard time too. Yeah.
Does the African elephant survive on the tundra diet, or do we also have to change its taste?
Ooh, yeah, good question. So the weird thing is, even though the woolly mammoth is more closely related to the African elephant, the elephants they're working with are Asian, because that's what they can get. It's harder to get your hands on an African elephant for these projects. And so they're already working with an elephant that is much more distantly related and has more of a forest type diet instead of the grassy diet of an elephant, a modern elephant, African elephant. So an African elephant diet-wise would probably be okay. A lot of the same, they're the same types of plants, the grasses, and there's no reason to think they'd be so different that they would have a hard time. An African elephant, though, I wonder about how that's going to work out from a diet perspective, for sure. It's a great question. Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.